Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the EAC presentation of the Environmentally Speaking Home and Yard Waste, Home and Yard Composting. We're so happy that you could be here tonight. Our EAC does a fabulous job hooking up about 3 or 4 of these presentations a year. So we're fortunate that we can get the best speakers, subject matter experts. So please, every time you see them in our guide, we'd love to have you out. This is going to be an interactive, so while Russ is speaking, feel free to ask questions and everything else like that. And he's going to impress us with some serious knowledge. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Russ Hartman of the Penn State Watershed and Penn State Master Gardeners.
Hey.
Thank you very much. Come on up, Russ.
Hey. I feel like I'm on a game show. Hi, everybody. I am local, by the way. I live about a mile from here on the other side of Langhorne Borough. So it's nice to be close to home and not schlepping far out in the reaches of the county. So glad to be here tonight to speak with you all. Tonight we are going to talk about composting basics. Basically what we're going to be talking about is composting at home. And we're not going to get into topics like vermicasting, which is raising worms essentially, and using their waste as a form of soil amendment. We're not going to get into some of the more exotic ways that you can actually compost in your closet in your house. There's ways to do that, believe it or not. So we're going to talk about that you have some space outside. It doesn't have to be large, but some space where you can actually do composting. So again, as Paul said, let's keep this informal. If you have questions as we go along, Paul will run around with a microphone so you can all hear each other's questions, and we can make this as easy as possible. So let me start out with a question for all of you. How many of you are currently composting at home? Okay, that's about right. Usually about half of the audience is already composting. How many of you have composted in the past and stopped? 1, okay. 1, 2. You gave it to your neighbors, okay. Yeah, that happens too, because sometimes we can start out down the road of composting and it just doesn't work out for us. Hopefully, if you're still interested in doing it, you'll learn some things tonight that'll make it easier for you to do. So, this is a little bit touchy here. So basically, all of us who do gardening, whether it's vegetable gardening or shrubs or flowers or plants, we all look for like having lush, verdant gardens. This is our goal, essentially, is to have that productive garden that we enjoy day in and day out. But all of this lushness is totally dependent on what goes on under the ground, because the health of your garden is dependent on the health of your soil. And compost is one of the key ways that you can get healthy soil in your lawn and garden at home. What compost does is it adds organic matter to the soil. A lot of us don't realize that the microbes that our plants are dependent upon for life, essentially, that live in the soil, they eat organic matter. That's what they live on. So if you have soil that's devoid of enough organic matter, you're not going to have as vibrant of a microbial community in your soil that you need for your plants to do well. And compost is the key way to get that organic matter into soil. Healthy soil is basically made up of the mineral component, which is silt, sand, and clay, air, water, and about 2 to 5% organic matter. Most of us don't think of soil as having air, but it does, and the air in the soil is essential for all the life underneath. Also, compost improves all soil types. Now, if all of you are living around here, you deal with clay, right? Lots of clay. And clay soil can be very frustrating for gardeners and for people who like to have nice lawns because it can be very tough to work. The good thing about clay is it's actually a very nutritionally rich soil. And so if you get enough organic matter into clay soil, you actually have the best soil for gardening. Unlike sandy soil, which tends not to hold on to water and nutrients, clay soil does hold on to nutrients and water quite well. There's some chemistry behind it. I'm not going to talk about it because you'll probably start to get dizzy. I don't understand it all either, but there's chemistry behind that. So whether you have clay soil that needs to have more drainage and air flow in that soil and organic matter, or you have sandy soil, compost is your answer for those soil types. Compost also functions as a mild fertilizer. It is not fertilizer in itself. It's not soil. We don't call it soil. It's not fertilizer. It's something different, and we call it a soil amendment. But it does provide some of the macronutrients that plants need, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's the NPK you see there, as well as a lot of micronutrients like magnesium and calcium. But it does it in a very gentle and natural way. As the compost breaks down by the microbial activity and the insect activity, then those nutrients are released into the soil that the plants can use. It also helps suppress plant disease. Now, when I do this talk, people often say, oh, what do I do? Like I throw it on my plants or whatever? No, it doesn't work that way. What it does is by increasing soil health and increasing the microbial activity in the soil, that helps plants be healthier and be able to defend themselves better against various diseases and various threats. So it has that ability for you to have healthier lawn and garden because you use compost than if you didn't. Now, some good environmental components to composting. It is the absolute best recycling, right? I mean, if you take all of your kitchen scraps, for example, and a lot of your leaves in your lawn and some grass clippings and things like that, and you compost those materials and you put them back on your lawn and garden, those nutrients cycle back through the life cycle. You might be picking tomatoes from your garden that have been nourished by the tomatoes you threw in your compost last year. So it's a perfect example of recycling. The other thing is, we throw a lot of food waste and yard waste into landfills. Now, fortunately, in Middletown, we have yard waste pickup. So if you're not composting your own yard waste, you do have a means for it to go and be composted for you, which is great. Not all townships in the county have that. Oh, something happened. A technical glitch. Sure. Yard waste. It gets composted. I'm not sure where it goes. Does anybody on the EAC know exactly where it goes? Yeah, usually, I mean, most of what they're collecting, that leaf waste becomes what we call leaf mold. And you can, yeah, so.
I think they sell it to like I don't know what waste management, like who they sell it to, but they turn it into compost and resell it. So they're getting paid twice. So that's why we should start doing this at home.
Then pay yourself, right? You just pay yourself with your yard waste and kitchen waste. So back to this graphic here, as I was saying, before Microsoft rudely interrupted me, that a lot of food waste goes into landfills, as do yard waste. So if you imagine, you look at that, we have almost, 34% of our landfills are filled up with stuff that could be recycled through the composting process and used to grow more food and to help sustain our gardens and our lawns and farms using compost. So it is absolutely a help for us to compost. Actually, I have paper and paperboard up there. You can compost certain paper and paperboard as well. There are some cities in the country that now have curbside composting where they pick up your organic waste, just like we have our recyclables picked up here, and they compost that. And you can either use it, they can distribute it for people to be able to use on their own properties, and to farms. It goes out to farms. So that's beginning to happen in the country, and hopefully we'll see more of that as time goes on. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking what's our trash and we're turning it into treasure, or what I like to call black gold. And I actually brought tonight some finished compost from my own composter, which you'll be able to check out close up afterwards. Just came fresh out before I came here. Fortunately, we're having this presentation tonight because next week all this is going out on my garden beds, ready for the fall extravaganza when we do major composting. And composting is really easy. I know for some of you who may have tried it and stopped it, it didn't feel so easy, but it is fairly easy to do once you get a system in place for taking care of it. And the recipe for it is really simple. It starts out with greens, browns, and black. So if you remember those three things, greens, browns, and black, that's your ingredients in this recipe. Greens are basically excellent sources of nitrogen. These are the kind of wetter material that we have, like for example, if you have peels from carrots, you have a piece of fruit that's gone bad in your kitchen, you have scraps off your dinner plate, those are all fall into the category we call greens. So you kind of know them mostly because they tend to be that slimy, wetter stuff that breaks down very quickly. Bacteria make very quick work of greens in the composting process. Whoops, I'm sliding by here. So people say to me, well, can I take the food off my plate that's left over that I'm not going to save and as leftovers and put that in my composting bucket? Yes, you can. You don't have to get really, really worried about, oh my gosh, is this little bit of sour cream going to bring rats to my compost pile? It won't. What I do advise is that you don't put in bones or fat or gristle from meat. But otherwise, whatever's left on your plate, you can put in. A lot of times what I do at home, we'll take a napkin, we'll clean off the plate into the bucket and throw the napkin in, because the napkin's going to break down too as part of the process. Fresh cut grass, very high in nitrogen. Now, best lawn care practice is that you use a mulching blade on your mower and that you cut your grass about a 3 to 4 inch height and leave those clippings on the lawn. That reduces significantly the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that you would put on your lawn in any given year because those clippings will break down fairly quickly. However, if you're composting, there are times where you're going to want to take some of those clippings and use them to help you get a batch going at home. And so probably about 2 or 3 times a year, I take my lawn clippings and they go into my compost pile as part of my startup for a new batch. Oh, you right before I said it, yes. So if you have sprayed herbicides on your lawn, you do not want to put those clippings into your compost pile because there are now some longer lasting herbicides. And a lot of times you'll know, but if you look at the bottle and it says, lasts up for 6 months, that's like, oh, isn't that great? No weeds for 6 months. It isn't great because it hangs around for a long time on your grass and on any of your clippings. So if you put them in your compost pile, you do run the risk of those chemicals not breaking down in the process and ending up killing your lovely tomato plants that you had had such great hopes for in the spring when you planted them. Another lovely source of nitrogen, manures of all kinds. Horse manure, cow manure, rabbits, chickens, and the bedding from their dens too, their pens. That's all good stuff to put into compost bin. Now, you're saying, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about greens. Well, manure obviously is not green, but it is considered a green for the purpose of composting because it's very high in nitrogen. And it's also kind of wet and slimy, so it kind of falls into a little bit of that. Pardon me? Dog? Well, okay, that question always comes up. Can I throw my dog's waste into my compost pile? We advise that you don't throw your dog or cat's waste into your compost pile just because there is a risk if you're not doing what we call hut composting, that some pathogens may make it through the composting process that you might not want in your garden. However, I can tell you, having spoken to many very seasoned composters, that sometimes they do throw their animal waste, not cats because it's got litter attached to it, you don't want that in your compost bin, but their dog waste into their compost pile. But you would have to decide that for yourself. We generally advise that you don't do that. Browns, okay, this is the season we're coming up for. This is major brown season. This is when the leaves start to fall. So the browns are an excellent source of carbon. So you get the message here. We have nitrogen in the greens. We have carbon in the browns. We need both for the microbes to do their job because they need those nutrients, both the nitrogen and the carbon. They're also something that decomposes slowly. So you'll know this if you're composting. You put all those leaves in, and they're breaking down slowly. You throw in the kitchen scraps, and like, where did they go in a week? It's like, I don't even see them anymore because the bacteria are able to take care of the greens very quickly. The browns more slowly because a lot of the parts of the browns have to be broken down by fungi. And if your pile is in its early stages and it's hot, the fungi aren't there. They're not doing their job until the pile begins to cool and do what we call cure. So the browns tend to take longer. They could be there for months or a year or more, depending on how much you've broken them up, like shredding leaves rather than throwing whole leaves into your compost pile. Paper, you can use shredded paper. Now a caution with paper, there's cautions with all this stuff. Don't use a glossy paper. So if you have a magazine, it's all glossy and lovely photos and everything, don't shred that and throw it in your compost pile because there are chemicals in those papers that you really don't want in your compost. But if you have like office paper that, or you have a newspaper, you have a pizza box that you can't put into the recycling bin, tear that baby up and throw it in your compost pile. It'll break down nicely, okay? Pardon me? Even with print. Most of the print that you see on these non-glossy productions is now soy-based ink. So it's not really a problem to compost with it. Even like wood shavings and sawdust can go into your pile. Oh, we have a question.
Can you compost rat and chinchilla pet bedding that's made out of paper?
Can I compost, I'm sorry?
Chinchilla and rat bedding that's
Chinchilla
paper.
and rat bedding. Now that is the first time I have ever gotten that question. Are you talking about their waste product along with the bedding and it's paper? Yes, you absolutely can. Good stuff. Yeah. You have a ready-made mix there, right? Because you got what? You got the greens, which is the poop. And am I allowed to say that on? Okay. And you got the browns, which is the paper. So it's kind of a nice mix, right? Caution with sawdust. Don't take a big bag of sawdust and pour it in your compost pile because you'll overwhelm it. And then nothing will happen. And you'll have a lot of sawdust sitting there for a long time. But if you mix some in with your compost pile, it's fine. Now, again, we're talking about greens and browns. And then we've already talked about one brown that's green, which is manure. But there's also things like potato skins and our favorite, coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are great in your compost pile, as are tea leaves and tea bags that are made out of paper and not plastic. Someone got the bright idea to decide to make some tea bags now out of plastic. Why would we do that? They work perfectly well with paper, which breaks down quite nicely in your compost pile. Actually, you can put coffee grounds directly on your soil if you choose to. It is high nitrogen, even though it's, again, black, brown, it's a green in the categorizing that we do. But I usually compost it. I think it helps charge the compost pile, and it's just nicer than just having coffee grounds all over your flower beds and garden. And then the third, the GBB, is black. Now, this is an optional ingredient in your compost. Just to kind of set the stage, black is basically either some finished compost, like I would reserve some of this. So if next week I'm putting all my compost, this batch, out of my gardens, I'm going to hold back a little bit of that as kind of an inoculant to throw into my new batches, which is going to start in a couple weeks when the leaves start to fall. Or if you don't have any finished compost, you can take a scoop of soil on your property, just a small shovelful, and throw that in because it's loaded with microbes. So there's, when you look at compost like that, there's about 1 billion bacteria in a gram of that material. And a gram of that material weighs like a paper clip. So there's a lot of bacteria in there, a lot of microbes in this black material. But also, all the things that you throw in there already have microbes on them, bacteria, fungal spores. They're everywhere. I mean, you don't like to think about it because it's like, ugh, I'm covered with this stuff. But we are, and that's reality. We depend on them completely to live. So even if you take those leaves off your lawn, the grass off your lawn, those food scraps in the kitchen, sorry to say, they're loaded with bacteria. So you don't have to do this step. We just kind of recommend it. It gives a little kickstart to your new compost batch. So now we need to talk about this carbon to nitrogen ratio. And this is what we're going for in composting. So we have the greens and the browns. We want to have a ratio of those in our compost pile. So we get somewhere in the 20 parts carbon to 40 parts carbon to 1 of nitrogen. That's what we're aiming for. Now, I have seen people get really crazy with this, and they start to weigh things, and they, yeah. Well, it's actually by weight, but when I'm advising you how to do composting, we do it by volume because it's a lot easier, and it works out. I tell you this because this is a science, but you don't need to get weird about it. I've seen people weigh things, and I have exactly this much of grass clippings, and I have this much of leaves, and I got this much of kitchen scraps, and I have this much of... You can go crazy trying to balance this all out to hit that perfect midpoint, which is somewhere around 25 to 30 parts carbon to nitrogen. That's where your ideal you're going for. But if we look at a chart here, you'll see instead of looking at what each thing is in terms of its carbon to nitrogen ratio, the things that we call greens, if you look at food scraps, they're 15 parts carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. So we consider those high nitrogen. And you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute, there's still a lot more carbon than there is nitrogen. Well, that's frankly because every living thing that we know of in the universe is based on carbon. All living things are carbon-based. So you're always going to have more carbon than nitrogen. But it's that proportion. So rotted manure, for example, is 25 to 1. Well, rotted manure, if you let it compost and cure, you can use that on your garden because it's already that perfect ratio. Sawdust, 500 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. So rather than worrying about this, what we recommend is that on a volume basis, you basically go with either 1 to 1 of browns to greens, up to 2 to 1 of browns to greens. And again, I'm saying up to because this is not precise. This isn't like baking a cake where you have to have the right ingredients or it's not going to happen because compost will happen no matter what. Organic matter will break down. So rather than losing sleep over it, if you're roughly equal parts or maybe a little more on the browns than the greens, you should be fine and it should work out. Now, these are the guys that do all the work. It's the FBI, and not the ones that work in DC in certain offices. It's actually fungi, the fungus, right? They do a lot of yeoman's work for us in the composting process, breaking down those browns, those tough-to-digest things. In fact, fungi, a lot of woody products have what are called lignins in them, and only fungi are able to break those down. The bacteria cannot break that down adequately. So you really need the fungus to do that work for you. And of course, there's the bacteria, which do the majority of the breaking down in the composting process. They love those greens. That fires them up. But they're working through the entire process. And when we compost, there's different types of bacteria that work at different stages of the composting process. And then finally, we have the invertebrates. Insects that come into the compost pile when it's no longer too hot to fry them when they go into it. And our favorite buddies, worms. So it's fun to watch as I compost in the early process when my pile's very hot, you don't see any creatures in there that you can see with your naked eye doing work in there. But as the pile finally gets to the point where it's curing and it's cooler, suddenly when I go in to aerate it, I see all these worms and there's different insects in there. Everybody's in there getting a piece of the action and working away on that material. So it's the FBI that does the heavy lifting for us. So, if you're composting, a lot of people like to use compost starters. And this has nothing to do with a particular brand. This is actually a very good brand. But you don't really need a compost starter. They're nice, but they're not necessary. Because as I said before, all the stuff you're throwing in there is already loaded with microbes. So when they're saying, well, our compost starter has all these mycorrhizae and all these bacteria and all this stuff in it, it does, but you don't really need it. So if you feel better about it, you can use it. You know, it's just one of those things you can use. A lot of them also, too, have nitrogen, some forms of nitrogen in them, which helps to kickstart the pile. So now we need to talk about what you cook your compost in, and there's several different ways to do it. Actually, there's a lot of different ways. We'll go over a few. One of the popular ones, yes?
So the bacteria is already part of the food, but where do the fungus and the worms come from? They just gravitate towards it?
The fungus are already, the fungal spores are already on the food and your leaves and your grass. In fact, as you and I breathe in and out, we're breathing in yeasts, and I know you don't want to hear about it. It gets a little bit disgusting. But that's life, right? I mean, you know, we're filled with bacteria, you know? That's the way things go. I mean, we have our own internal composting systems that we call digestion. The worms? From the ground, usually from the ground up. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. The bottom has a grid on it. And the grid has holes that are gigantic for a worm to get through, but not big enough for a rat or a mouse or some other little critter to get through. Yeah, a lot don't. They just sit right on the ground. But you definitely, if you're doing outdoor composting, you definitely want to have soil contact if you can. So these bins, these are what we call a closed bin system. They're very popular, especially if you're in an area where you don't have either much yard space, or you might live in an HOA where you're not allowed to have an open compost pile in your yard, but you could have this. Because if you're composting correctly, it doesn't smell. I know it's hard to believe, but it doesn't. If it does smell, you've got a problem that you've got to take care of, and we're going to talk about what that is. So the theory behind these bin systems is that you add your materials, your greens and browns, hopefully in somewhat equal parts, and mix them up and do all that stuff. And then as they're breaking down on the lower level, you're continuing to add more stuff on the top. And so you see there's doors on the bottom on both sides, and you can take out the finished compost from the bottom, and then the unfinished stuff drops down, and you just keep a continuous process going. They do somewhat work like that. I've been doing closed bin composting for a number of years now because I don't have the space to do the open bin. But I like to get a lot of compost in a year, and I do hot composting. So I get 2 batches a year out of my composter. And so for that reason, I actually do these in batches rather than adding forever. I'll add through the process until I need it to cure before I'm going to use it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But these generally work fairly well. And there's different models of them. There's some that are insulated. There's some that have an aeration tube that goes down the middle of them called the aero bin. So there's a lot of versions of these. My one advice to you would be that if you want to be able to do the hot composting, which is actually good to do if you can, to have at least a cubic yard size, internal size of your bin. If you get much below that, there's not enough mass to heat up. And that heating process actually helps destroy weed seeds and pathogens in your compost. So it is something to think about. Another model, very popular, the tumblers, compost tumblers. Has anybody here used a tumbler? And do you have good luck with it? Metza, metza. Have you had problems with it? You do have to keep turning it, yeah. That's to aerate it, yeah, and keep it mixed. But do things break down and you get a satisfactory compost out of it? Okay, yeah. Uh-huh. You will know by the end of tonight. Do you have a 2-chamber one? Those are good. The 2-chamber ones are ones I recommend to people if you're going to do a tumbler. One of the appeals of the tumbler is that it's easy to aerate because you can turn it. The downside is the volume is lower, the volume of material, so it doesn't really get hot. It breaks down over time, but it's more of what we call a cold composting that goes on in there. And common problems I've seen with folks who need a troubleshooting for their tumbler is they don't have enough browns in there. They're like throwing all their kitchen scraps in, but no browns, and you need both to really have it successfully work. This is a very common model, which is the open bin system. This is a 3-bin system here called the Lehigh bin system. I don't know why, but that's what they call it. This is a project that the Master Gardeners that we did down in Bristol Borough at a community garden called Adams Hollow Community Garden. We basically built this bin system with pallets we got for free and T-posts, so it's low budget. And we taught the gardeners there, the members of the community garden, how to compost. And they've been doing it quite successfully ever since. Because Lord knows they have plenty of material that comes out of that garden to compost. So the idea behind this system is essentially you put material in one bin, and when that gets full, you move it over to the second bin, and then start putting material again in the first bin. And when this bin is full, you move everything in here to the third bin, everything in the first to the third, and then start over. And so by the time this bin is full, this bin's usually done, and you have finished compost. Now, good points about it. Well, there are a lot of good points, actually, because you can make a high volume of compost with it. Most of us don't have yards big enough to hold something like this, but you could do a single open bin in your yard. The nice thing is that you're not turning it all the time. So the turning process is basically the movement of the material from one bin to the other, and that's the turning and the mixing of the compost material. The downside is that's a big job. That is a heavy job to do, and if you've ever had to do it, you get your work out for about a week after you move one bin to the other, but it's very effective. Works quite well. So if you do all these things, you've got the container you're going to basically cook your compost in, you got your ingredients, you got the right mix, the FBI loves you and they're living there happily and working away, you end up with a really good compost. So once you've picked the pot, so to speak, you're going to work in, you're going to add your ingredients. So if you look here, you'll see I have shredded leaves. That's some browns. I have black there, that's finished compost. I have greens, freshly cut grass, and kitchen scraps. And all that goes into the bin. So what we do is when we get those materials in there, we mix them up as best we can. And then we add water. I cannot emphasize for you how important water is in the process of composting. Bacteria, these microbes, the FBI, they need air, water, and food, just like we do. You don't give them enough air, they slow down, they go dormant. You don't give them water, they slow down and they go dormant. So you have to make sure you're getting that compost stays moist. Now, that doesn't mean like you pick it up and squeeze it and water pours out of it. It means you pick it up and squeeze it and it's damp like a sponge that you've wrung out very well. That's like an ideal amount of moisture. And if you, tonight, you can feel this finished compost, you'll feel that moisture in there, but it's not wet. You can't get any water out of it. That's the ideal amount of water, but water is actually crucial to your pile. So after you get the ingredients, you mix them up, you add water, you wait. And if you've got enough material in there, in probably a couple days, that pile is going to start to get very hot. That's the first phase in a composting batch. It's going to get very hot. So we're talking about that pile's center going anywhere from 90 to 160 degrees. You don't have to have a thermometer to compost. They're nice to have. I have one. I brought it with me right here. Works great. Stays in my pile all the time, so I always know what's going on in there. But at those temperatures, when you get up to about 130 degrees, it starts to kill off weed seeds, as well as other seeds, like the tomatoes you threw in, the tomato seeds you threw in, and certain plant pathogens. So when that compost is finished, those things aren't active anymore. And that's a nice benefit for hot composting. It also helps break down the material faster. So your pile we heat up. Once that pile gets really hot, you'll notice that the temperature starts to drop. And as that pile starts to cool, what you want to do is turn it. And you want to turn it, that doesn't mean you have to flip the whole thing over. It means you want to aerate it. So you want to get air into that pile because what's happening is the oxygen is being used up. So you want to turn that pile, and what you'll find is it'll start to heat up again. That turning gets that critical air in there. Now, if the idea of turning or aerating, and I'll show you this is a compost aerator, nifty little tool, looks like a big corkscrew. Rather than getting in there with a pitchfork or a shovel, you're basically putting this in your pile, turning it down, pulling it up, turning it down, pulling it up. You're creating air channels. Very easy to do. It'll save your back and your sanity at the same time, which you can't beat. This is a passive aeration system. We did a demonstration site over at Snipes Farm. Probably most of you know Snipes Farm. We have a composting demonstration site there. And we're doing passive aeration in that site. We're testing it out. Basically what you're doing is you're putting either PVC pipes or roll cylinders of hardware cloth into the pile as you're adding the material. And so that passively gets air constantly going into your pile. In commercial composting operations, they will actually aerate the piles from underneath. They build an aeration system that all the material goes on top of, and they actually blow air periodically up through the bottom of the pile. That's how critical it is to the process. So making sure you aerate your pile is really important. So once you've done all this stuff, you've got some black gold there. Your compost is ready to use. Any questions so far? Early on, you're going to aerate more often than later in the process. When your pile is what we call curing, you typically don't have to aerate it more than probably once every 3 or 4 weeks. But in the early stages, I would say in the first week or two, you want to get some air into it at least 3 times a week. Gotcha. No, tumbler is an aeration process. So by tumbling it, you're aerating it. Yeah. Well, they both rotate together, don't they? Oh, they don't. Oh, so you have actually 2 separate drums. Okay. Again, probably early on, if you're starting a batch, you would want to do that probably a few times a week. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes people say, can I aerate my pile too much? The technical answer is no. You really can't. First of all, you're not going to have enough energy to do it too much. But the bigger problem is that you don't aerate it at all. And then it slows way down, and it'll take a long time to decompose. That's a bigger problem than worrying about over-aerating it. Sure.
Do you have to place these bins or whatever, like in direct sunlight?
You do not. You do not. Mine is on the north side of my house, shady.
Oh.
And you can see it works pretty well. A lot of people like to put it on the sunny side of their property or their house in a sunny area because, especially in the winter, if you put it on the south side of your house, you'll get some heat from the sun, which helps that pile not cool as fast. because in wintertime, the bacterial activity slows down dramatically. So your composter is really just kind of holding its own through winter. That doesn't mean you shouldn't add things and compost through the winter. I do all year round. But it's going to slow down quite a bit. And it makes sense, right? Because why do we put things in a refrigerator? The cold air slows the bacteria down from decaying your food. Same principle in a composter in winter. So some people like to have it to get some sunlight for it. The thing is, if you put it in direct full sun, you're going to have to water it more often because it's going to dry out faster, right? So if you're okay with that, as long as you monitor the moisture level, you should be okay. But it doesn't have to be, yeah.
What would you say would be a good guideline for knowing that if you've done your job right, that it's done? How would you recognize?
Oh, I'm going to tell you that in a few minutes, okay? Yeah, that's always a question, like, when's it ready? I just want to have this slide up here. It is okay to be slow. If you really said, I don't really know that I need to have a hot pile. I just want to put some stuff together and let it break down. It might take a year and a half to get to the point where you can put it out in your garden. That's okay. It will break down. I mean, we always like to joke with each other saying, compost happens. You know, you put organic matter together and microbes, and it's going to happen. So you don't have to fret about it. It's better to do it and be slow, you know, have it be a slow pile or a cold pile, as you call it, than not do it at all. So let's talk a few ways to use compost. It's very versatile stuff. So spring gardening, doing what we call a top dressing on your garden is a good practice. So if you put compost out about 1 inch or 2 on top of your garden around your plants, it's a great practice. That material will all break down into the soil. The FBI will continue the work on it. One thing I want to point out to you is we often don't talk about compost being finished but ready. And the reason for that is it takes about 5 years for what you see here, which is ready, to completely break down into its component molecules. So that compost, when I put it on my garden, it's going to be about another 5 years before that's like gone completely. So you don't want to put too much on your garden. Like more isn't better, let's put it that way, because you can over-fertilize your garden with it. But spring is a good time, especially on vegetable beds and annual flower beds, to put a top dressing of compost. If you're starting a new bed or you have a bed that you think this needs more organic material, you can put about a 6-inch layer of compost on top and dig it in. Once you do that once in like a raised bed or an in-ground bed, you do not need to do it again. You can then go to putting a top dressing on without digging anything in. Well, some people, like they say, oh, I put my compost on, and then I took my garden fork and turned it into the soil because I want to make sure it all gets in there. It's like, don't do that. Because the downside of turning and tilling your soil is worse than just putting the compost on top and letting it break down. It gets into the soil. I know it sounds crazy, but it does. The insects pull it down into the soil. There's microbes all over it. They're continuing to work on it and break down the material and make nutrients available. So you don't have to worry about it. It will condition your soil.
I've heard of some people saying you take some of your compost and make it into like a tea, add a lot of water, shake it up, pour that on your soil to let it soak in a little quicker. What do you think of that?
I think an easier way is put the compost on the soil, let the rain hit it, and it makes tea. Well, not this year. In fact, I should back up and say, well, or when you water it. I know there are a lot of people who are compost tea lovers. And some people spray it. They'll make the tea and they'll spray it all over their plants, saying, well, I'm adding microbes and it's killing diseases. There isn't a whole lot of scientific evidence behind that. Plants have a limited ability to take nutrients in through their leaves. So if you're spraying fertilizers or compost tea on the leaves of your plants, they can only take in a small portion of that. It's not like they don't absorb any of it, they do, but not a lot. The nutrient uptake's mostly, the lion's share is coming through the root system. So you're better off worrying about what's going on underground with your root system, and do you have a healthy, what we call a rhizosphere of microbes and the fungi, the FBI in there, helping the plants.
Do people go crazy and soil test their compost?
You can do that if you want. You can get an analysis on it. You generally don't need to do that. If you're kind of following decent composting principles and you're using a mix of greens and browns, you're going to come in somewhere with an analysis that's like what I told you earlier on, where it's like 1% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, 1% potassium in the macronutrients. Now, one way to test your compost, and this might get a little bit to your question about, some people say, well, if my compost is still not broken down enough for me to put it on my garden and have it be safe, how can I test it? Well, there's an easy way to test it is, you take 2 small pots, get some pea or bean or radish seeds, something that germinates quickly. You put 1 pot with just your regular garden soil in, and the other you put in a mixture of half garden soil and half compost, and plant the seeds. And if you see that they both come up nice and healthy together, your compost is fine. If you see that there's a problem with the pot that has the compost, that means that compost needs more time to cure before you put it out on your garden. But usually you can eyeball it, you can do the not taste it, don't taste it. You can do the touch test, the look at it test, the smell test, and usually that's pretty good. That's pretty reliable. You can put compost into your potting soil. About 30% of your mix is good. You can also use compost on your perennial beds. Oh, I'm sorry, did I miss a question?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're talking about putting the compost on a garden for vegetables and whatnot. What's the difference between the composting and, say, mulching? Are we mulching here? Is something we're doing?
Mulching. Okay, compost makes an excellent mulch. Essentially, you are mulching with compost is what you're doing. But you can mulch with straw, you can mulch with shredded hardwood, you can mulch with bark nuggets. I mean, you go to any big box store and you're going to see all these different types of mulch that you can put on your beds. Mulch has a different purpose, though, than compost. I mean, the compost is already pretty well decomposing, and it's going to go into the soil as an amendment, where mulch is designed to protect the soil and your plants. It helps prevent erosion, and it helps prevent compaction of the soil when you put a mulch on it. And it looks nice, too. But that's really the purpose of a mulch. It takes a lot longer to break down. But you can use compost as a mulch if you want. You can use compost as a mulch anywhere. It'll just break down faster than the kind of mulch you'd buy in bags and put out on your garden beds. But I mulch with compost a lot. It works great. Perennial beds, I suggest that you put a layer, that 1 to 2 inch layer on your perennial beds in the fall. You can put it in the spring, it's not a problem. But in the fall, you have all winter for that to continue to break down and add more of those nutrients to the soil. Also, you can use compost on your lawn. Lawns love it. Everybody says, what do you mean I'm going to put compost on my lawn? Well, it doesn't look like that when you're done. But that's the way you put it on. You make little mounds of it around your lawn, and then you take a leaf rake or a garden rake, and you spread it out. You just rake it out over the lawn, so you have about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch of compost. If you're cutting your lawn at the right height, which is 3 to 4 inches, it just falls down between the blades. And it will nicely break down there and both feed your lawn and improve your soil. And for all of us who live in the world of clay here, it's a great way to have a healthier soil for your lawn. Let's talk about some things we shouldn't do in compost. We've already talked about a couple of them, so I'll breeze by them. Don't throw your cat in your compost pile. They'll never forgive you. Cat waste, don't throw it in your pile. Same for Fido. Don't throw his waste in unless you really feel compelled to, as we talked about before. I mentioned meat. Don't throw in meat scraps, fat, gristle, bone. The reason for that is not because they won't break down. They will. Bones will take a long, long, long time to break down. But they can attract vermin, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to attract animals to your compost bin outside. If, however, you're doing an indoor composting method, throw it in, it'll work. Don't throw charcoal briquettes in. The reason for that is they are infused with chemicals that you don't want in your compost. But if you have natural hardwood charcoal, or you've made a fire in your fire pit with wood, and you haven't used a chemical starter on it, that ash can all go in your compost pile. It's fine. Well, it's like everything in moderation in life. The same with your compost pile. Just like you wouldn't want to throw a huge bag of sawdust into your pile, you don't want to throw like huge amounts of ash in at any one time.
If you put in ash, it's going to raise the pH.
It will alter the pH. You can, if you want to take the time to check the pH after you've added ash, yeah. Well, one of the things with the pH changes over time in your compost. So as it's in different phases of the process of breaking down, that pH is changing. So one of the things compost does very well is it kind of balances out to around a 6.5 to 7 pH over the course of the process, unless you've done something like put in way too much ash. Well, we use that to talk about the acidity or the base or alkalinity of materials, of soil. So the perfectly neutral pH is 7. So it's not alkaline, it's not acid, it's in the middle. 6.5 is a little bit acidic, but not too much. Most gardens, vegetable gardens, want to be around 6.5, somewhere in that range. Lawns like to be a little bit higher, somewhere right around 7. Okay. And you taught that in school, so you could tell us, you could give us a lesson. Okay, should we throw weeds in the compost pile? I always like to ask this question. Should we throw weeds in? Yeses, nos. Yes, you can throw weeds in your compost pile. In fact, sometimes that's all you have to throw in is weeds. But a cautionary note, I would not throw this weed in this condition in. Why? Because it's gone to seed. And if I'm not running a hot enough pile, those lovely little dandelion seeds will survive the process and end up growing in your tomato garden. So if you're doing good cultural practice with your gardens, you're going to be weeding somewhat regularly. It's best to get them out before they go to seed. As long as they haven't gone to seed, except for some exceptions we're going to talk about, they're fine to put into your compost, and they do count as a green. Some weeds you should not put in your compost pile because you can't predict reliably it's going to get hot enough to kill them. One is lesser celandine, which we all see every spring all over here, everywhere. And we all say, isn't that a lovely little flower? It's a terrorist. It's an invasive terrorist. It has taken over our woodlands. It has taken over our yards and gardens. It has multiple strategies for reproducing. That's one of the characteristics of exotic invasive plants. So it has little bulblets, and then underground, and then it produces seed, and then it's got all these mechanisms. So if you don't put it in your compost, because if it survives it, you'll be really sorry that you did. The other one here, Japanese knotweed, the bane of my existence. Japanese knotweed has, again, many methods of reproducing. Its most powerful method is little pieces of it get washed downstream or get broken up when people say, let me dig this out, and they didn't get every little bit of it. And it goes wild from those little pieces. So if you have pieces of that in your compost pile and it hasn't died in the process, you'll be sorry because it'll be growing wherever you put it. And then Japanese stilt grass. We have a lot of that around here. You probably recognize it from the photo. Some of it might be coming up in your grass in your yard. That is one, too, that you don't want to throw in your compost pile. But otherwise, you can put weeds in. What about disease plants? Can you, oh, sure.
Put these in the trash.
Put those in the landfill.
In the, okay,
Yes,
the trash,
yes,
trash, not the
yes.
recycle
I wouldn't even put them,
waste.
like, I did a major getting out the Japanese knotweed from the wooded part of my property. And I did not even send that to the yard waste collection. I did not want to risk having that go there. So I piled it all up on a tarp and let it desiccate completely. And then it all was picked up to go to a landfill. Yeah, that's where Japanese knotweed belongs, in a landfill, many feet below the surface of the earth. Disease plants. Can you put plants that have diseases in your compost pile? John, you're saying no.
If they have viruses can survive,
That's true. Some of them can. Yeah.
especially tomato plants.
Yeah, it depends what the disease is. So yeah, it really depends on the disease. So if you have late blight on your tomatoes or potato plants, you don't want to throw that in. Black knot on prunus families like cherries and things like that. You don't want to put that in. And some soil-borne diseases like fusarium wilt, which some tomatoes are very susceptible to fusarium wilt, and verticillium wilt, which lives in the soil, it will survive the composting process. So you have to be the judge about that. Like somebody said to me, oh, look at all these zucchini plants. They have powdery mildew all over them. Can I throw them in my compost? Absolutely. Why? Because powdery mildew is everywhere. It's in the air, we breathe it in, it's everywhere. And even if you keep that out of your compost pile, it's already in your compost pile. So, you know, those are things you don't have to worry about disease-wise. I mean, look at this. Do you think there's any weed seeds or pathogens in there? Very likely, yes. Okay, let's talk about some problem solving. One, my pile won't get hot. Well, one reason it might not get hot is you might just not have a big enough pile. You don't have enough material. As I had mentioned before, about a cubic yard is ideal, an ideal minimum, I would say. But if it's not heating up and you have enough material, add some green stuff. Fresh cut grass is good. Some of those weeds that haven't gone to seed is good. And turn it and wait. So you're going to turn it to aerate it and wait, and it should heat up. If your pile stinks, you have a problem. It means that your pile is basically fermenting. It's an anaerobic fermentation going on, which means you need to add some browns, some dry material, browns, and you need to aerate it. Because again, if you don't get air into your pile, it will go anaerobic, and it'll start to ferment rather than compost. And you don't want that because that really does smell. If some stuff won't break down, sometimes people throw in things that are very different composition and size into their compost pile. And when you get to composting, this is an area where size matters and smaller is better. So the more broken up the pieces of things you throw in there are, the more surface area the FBI has to work on, and the faster it'll break down. So you should consider shredding as one method of dealing with this. That's like a little shredder there, but you can do things we were chatting before the talk about having those blower vacs where you can suck up the leaves and shred them, or put all the leaves in the trash can and put your weed trimmer down in there, your string trimmer, and move it up and down and break up your leaves. Another great way is on your lawn, when you get a thin layer of leaves, take your lawnmower out with the bag on it, run it over, and you're getting a nice mix of greens and browns right there, right? All chopped up. Perfect. Throw it in your compost pile. So you're going to add some greens. In that case, you're going to turn it to get air, and you're going to wait, and it'll get back to working. Now we're getting to your question. How do I know when my compost is ready? Well, it's going to be crumbly and loose, somewhat like this. It's going to smell earthy, which it does. You can smell it for yourself. And it's going to be about 2/3 of the original volume of what you put in there. Sometimes even only a half of what you put in. And people said, where did all my compost go? I had this huge pile of stuff I threw in there. Well, it's broken down. So that's pretty much how you know. She really, does that help with knowing when it's ready? Yeah. I mean, you can pretty much do the smell, touch, and look at it test. So when it's ready, you can put it out whatever use you're going to use. I do suggest that you consider sifting your compost because there's always times where there's something that shows up there that didn't break down. If you're going to use it in a potting soil mix, it's a good idea to sift it. You don't want big chunks in your potting soil. If you're going to put it on your lawn, it's a good idea to sift it because, again, you don't want big chunks. But if you have some chunky stuff in there and you put it on your vegetable beds or your perennial beds, whatever, you don't have to worry about it. It's fine, it'll break down. Unless you really like doing this job of sifting compost, in which case you can do it. All right, so let's just review. We're going to combine roughly equal parts of greens and browns. You can go up to as much as 2-to-1 browns to greens, but roughly equal is we think is best. If you have it, add a shovelful of the black stuff. That would be finished compost or some garden soil. Mix it well, get some water on it, and make sure the moisture stays there throughout the composting time. Wait for it to heat up and aerate it frequently. And if you do all that, you're going to be able to enjoy the results of that black gold working its magic on your garden beds and your lawn. So I do have some resources for composting here. These are some materials you can read. I'm going to leave this up here for a bit, so if you want to take a photo or take notes, you can do that. This book, Compost Science for Gardeners by Robert Pavlis, fairly recent publication, it's very good. It's not a big read, it's only about that thick, but it's... Oh, you have a question?
Yeah. Recently, I've been adding crushed, ground up eggshells.
Yes.
To what limit? And I've been also adding some new chemicals like a little bit of Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate.
Yeah.
But my big other question is, how can I incorporate maybe a little iron into this? Is there a way, or don't bother?
I wouldn't bother.
Okay.
Yeah, I really wouldn't bother with it.
Well, there's iron in the chlorophyll in the leaves.
Yeah.
But I was...
Yeah, because remember, the compost is a soil amendment. It's not a fertilizer because it sounds a little bit like you're trying to create a fertilizer out of it. And it's not really it has mild fertilizing capabilities, but its real purpose is to be food for microbes and to improve your soil. So it's a soil amendment. So you can do those kinds of things if you want, but you don't really need to. If you've got a mix of stuff going in there, those greens and browns, you've got a lot of micronutrients and macronutrients in there. So you don't have to really worry about that.
I have another question. I'd like to make it as simple as possible for myself, and I've been doing composting for a number of years. In fact, it's very exciting, like waiting for it to come to fruition, you know. And I always get a little disappointed after I harvest it. Oh, I wish I had more. Because once you start throwing it on plants and trees, it goes quick. But anyway, adding water, just by eyeballing it or touching it, how much water, how do you know if you're adding enough or too much?
All right, when you start your pile, if you're starting fresh with a new pile, typically people say water it until you see water coming out the bottom of the pile. And that's usually a good start. When you're in the composting process and you've aerated, when I aerate it, I check it for moisture. I just stick my hand in there, not when it's real hot, by the way. Don't stick your hand into a hot compost pile. You can get second-degree burns. That's how hot it gets. Then I will feel it for moisture to make sure that it's wet enough. Sometimes you can tell by looking at it because it looks bone dry. And if you just dig down a little bit, it still looks dry. If you see that, you need to water it. And you just put enough on and toss it a little bit to see, so it's moist. The thing is, any excess water is going to drain out of the pile, but it'll take a while, and it could lead to you going into an anaerobic environment rather than an aerobic environment.
Thanks, Paul. So when you're setting up your compost, you have to start with everything that you're going to be composting, right? It's not like it's something you can set up and then every night after dinner add your scraps,
Yeah, you
like
can
on
do
a
that.
continual basis.
You can do that, yeah. What I was talking about is if you're starting a batch, you'd like to have a mixture of different things to put in it, but you might not have enough of one thing or another. You may have a lot of browns because it's autumn and leaves are falling and you got tons of leaves. That's where you might go for some greens by taking the dying vegetable garden, things like tomato plants, bean plants, chopping them up and throwing them in for greens, and taking some of your grass clippings to get in there. But you're never going to have a perfect balance. When we do composting demonstration sites, we always set up a bin that we call the Brown's Reserve, because at certain times of year, like in the middle of the summer, there isn't much brown around to throw in your pile. So if you're adding all these greens, you need some browns to throw in there. So we'll have some extra leaves from the winter, some straw from taking straw off as a mulch and putting fresh straw on, and we'll keep that all in that reserve. So if you have a lot of greens you're putting in, you can take some of those browns and add them.
Russ, one thing that I've done is put the brown shredded leaves that I've done in plastic trash bags and just store them by my compost pile. So in the spring, when I'm starting to mow the lawn and I have lots of greens, I have all these shredded browns sitting right next to the compost pile, and I just mix it in and just add to it, and it works out great.
Yep, that's a real good idea. That's a Brown's Reserve. That's what you've created. My wooded part of my property, I actually, after I get my first batch going and it's filled, my compost bin is absolutely filled. All the other subsequent batches of leaves go out and I just pile them in the woods, in the wooded area, and I leave them there. That's my Brown's Reserve, and I can pull them in as I need them across the rest of the year. Yeah, just tear it up. Yeah, if you throw like a whole box in there, like an Amazon box or something like that, it's going to be there for a long time. But if you tear it up and mix it in, it'll break down faster.
I was told that you shouldn't use oranges or onions or garlic in your garden, in your compost.
I wouldn't have a compost pile if I didn't use those things.
Okay, good.
Oh, you can absolutely use it. I think that's getting mixed up with vermicasting.
Okay.
Worms that you're raising, if you're raising worms in your basement or outside for their castings, they don't like too much citrus.
Okay.
So you can put some in, but not a lot. But for this type of composting, throw it in. It's great
Okay.
stuff.
And it was also don't use eggshells because worms won't come into your compost because it'll rip their little bodies up for some
Oh my
ridiculous
good.
thing.
Well,
Okay, good.
no. All right, the eggshell question always comes up every time I do this presentation. Can I throw eggshells in my pile? Now, John, you said you're actually throwing them in. You're grinding them up. Okay, that is a good practice. Eggshells will take years and years and years to break down in your compost. They're very, very resilient for a good reason, because they're harboring a little life right inside of them. So they take a long time to break down. If you're going to put them in your pile, I suggest you do like what John suggested, is you break them up. Some people put them in a blender with some water and make a slurry out of it and pour that in. It's easier than all the breaking stuff. Use your Ninja blender or whatever the heck you have to do that. Just remember that you'll see these tiny white specks in your compost. When it's ready to go, when it looks like that, it'll be filled with little white specks because they will not have broken down yet. It takes years, but it's okay. So I say use eggshells if you want. And the worms will survive it. It's amazing what they can survive.
Can you put in wood pellet ash?
Yes, if those, yeah, I know people that compost and use wood pellet ash. I'm not familiar with pellets enough myself to tell you, are there chemicals in there you don't want in your compost? Yeah, so it should be fine. Okay, well, thank you all very much. I'm here for a little bit longer if you want to ask me any questions. Whoops. There's the master gardener and watershed hotline. So if you have a gardening question, you have a composting question, you're not sure, always feel free to call or email us, and one of the master gardeners will get back to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Russ Hartman.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Russ.
You're
Russ
welcome.
has handouts
We have
that'll be on
materials.
the back table for you. Kitchen magnets, always a good thing. So, folks,
You
real
gotta
quick,
hold up that refrigerator.
I'm just selling a few things real quick. I am the Park and Rec Director. The third Tuesday of October, there is another environmentally speaking series scheduled. If you want to see what it is, if you grab one of those guides over there, first page. So we usually do the third Tuesday of September and October each year. So feel free, love to have you. Program notes. This Saturday, we're doing a trash cleanup on Trenton Road. So if you can go to the Senior Center on 2140 Trenton Road and you want to give an hour, it's a 2-hour gig, but if you want to just show up for a half hour, an hour, and clean up along Trenton Road, love to have you. If you want to do pickleball classes, we got that too. And if you want to do a free walk at Tyler State Park for about 3 or 4 miles, we got that. I've sold everything I could sell. There we go. So thank you so much for coming out. Thank you so much, Russ Hartman, for coming out tonight. We appreciate it. Everybody have a great evening.